Hello and welcome to another plus-sized kite review. Today, as you might have guessed, I'll be discussing my time so far on the new North Orbit Ultra, and for a little bonus, the new Atmos Carbon Pro model board at the end. First off, a huge thanks to the team at North New Zealand who were kind enough to let me demo this kite. But I'll also just give a shout out once again to the team at Mac Kiteboarding for helping me with so many of my reviews lately, and no doubt they will have it on their website soon. So follow the link in the description to check out their range of North gear. Because we are going to be seeing 3 new versions of the Orbit coming out this season, and I have only ridden the new Ultra so far, I will be trying to add to this review in a full spectrum Orbit range roundup, where I hopefully will have an opportunity to get more time on this kite and have ridden the others, and so we'll be able to compare all the Orbits back to back to back. But I wanted to get this initial thoughts review out as soon as possible because I have been getting asked about this kite dozens of times now for some months, and I finally got to try it recently and had an absolute blast on it, despite it having some challenges for me personally. So this review might not answer all your questions about this hotly anticipated entry into the North lineup, but I'll do my best based on the experience I've had so far. Now, first off, the more I've ridden on Alula kites, the more I've come to realize they are not all automatically going to be guaranteed a massive leap up in overall performance over the rest of the market that I originally experienced when I tried the Evo D-Lab well over a year ago now. And it has been really interesting over this last year to see how each brand, when making an Alula kite, has used the material to highlight different aspects of their own kites, to either try and one-up the market, provide a better competitive edge for their team riders, or simply provide another level of performance for their own designs to their more dedicated and monetarily capable customers. With the Ultra, I'm not really sure what I was expecting going into it because their range has always been so good at what it does, and among my favorites overall for big air, fun, and progression. And now that I have ridden the Ultra a little bit, like when I first tried the Orbit Pro, I'm still not quite sure if I'm really the rider it was made for. Now, let me unpack that a little bit more by breaking it down into each area that I usually discuss and comparing it as always to what I have been riding the most recently in the market. So first off, after you've launched the kite, as you would expect, it moves quickly and likes to occupy a space more forward in the window like most Alula kites do, due to their rigidity and thinner leading edge. Always a good sign you're going to be getting some speed assistance when sending the kite, and if timed correctly, launching more consistently vertically than how non-Alula kites would, like the Orbit predecessors. Because of some of my preconceived notions of what Alula would mean for each kite it was on, I was quite surprised when I got out on the water, however, at how heavy the bar pressure was on the 9 meter I was riding. Although it's not getting up to the weight on the bar as some of the heavier big air kites I can think of, like the Rebel, Edge, or XR, it didn't feel as light as other Alula kites like the D-Lab or Vortex, or even non-Alula kites like the Harlem Force, or potentially even the previous year's Orbit Pro. This increase in bar pressure seems to be a result of the moderate increase in power over the previous Orbits, which translated nicely to getting more lift in your boosts. However, I found a little bit challenging with some of the additional need for force in combination with the speed of the kite. I've mentioned in the past reviews that I no longer like the feel of the heavier bars with the faster or smaller kites because you tend to do more than you need to at times, and it can be tricky to feel just the right amount. So although I was using the Epic and lighter Nav Pro bar, the added pressure on the bar did make me struggle a little bit to feel like I was getting just the right timing with this kite because of its speed and power. This certainly is a little bit nitpicky for sure, but we are talking about the best of the best with kites like this, and I am trying to be somewhat specific as to my overall experience. Now on the more enjoyable side, when I was sending the kite, I can say that in the respective wind I was riding, I've never felt such power from an orbit. The sing power also translated into more aggressive and enjoyably angry kite loops when you pulled slow and managed to get the kite a bit lower in the window, which admittedly was tricky because of how fast this kite loops. The speed of the kite, however, did make timing the boosts just right a bit more challenging, of course, and I did oversend the kite here and there while I was getting used to it, much like I found with the Orbit Pro when I first flew it around. Like you'd expect, the kite does have that position in the window that when jumping allows you to grab more gusts and have an elevated lift over the past orbits as well. And because my time so far on it has been limited to just a few sessions, I can't say for sure where it fits in terms of boosting potential in regards to the rest of the market, although I am confident it has more power and lift than the other orbits and nitros. It's just hard to say how powerful it is when compared to all the boosting big air kites on the market. I think I would put it somewhere around the same level as the Ozone Vortex or Fly Surfer era, but still a level below some of the biggest boosters I've ridden, like my Evo D-Labs, the perhaps Rebel SLS, or the XR series. With the newly added speed and power, I was having a great time though riding around on this kite and pulling some chunky loops with it, but I must say that the bar pressure, yank, and overall perceived power increase did sap some of my confidence to try many tricks. And a couple of times I found the yank throwing me off my axis a little bit here and there when I did try some, which you can see in this back roll loop where I almost eat a whole ton of shit on when I'm pulled off of my rotation a little bit and can't decide if I need to go into a second one or try to pull myself back and recover. Luckily I managed to. Because this kite is of course very fast, I don't think it's any surprise that it is the fastest orbit yet, but it would be hard to say how much faster it is than the Orbit Pro at this stage, having not rode them back to back. But a small percentage, somewhere up to, but I don't think more than 5% sounds about right, which of course makes a bigger difference the more wind you get. I did feel while I was on it that first session that it was easier for me to go out and ride and loop both ways than I remember the Orbit Pro being the first time I tried it, and also more stable. Mind you, when I did test the Orbit Pro, I had not been riding as many different kites on the market, and I think my skills and ability to jump from different kite to kite have improved a lot since then, in the last year, because of how many kites I've been testing. Like with many Alula kites, I think if you are coming from Dacron, this kite could be a challenge to get used to because of its pace, but if you are coming from other Alula kites, although the speed may be familiar, and possibly faster, the added weight on the bar might take some getting used to and potentially be a put-off if you're expecting it to be super light. Which places this kite in kind of an odd place, feeling a bit like a mix of both worlds in some way, at least if you're not of course riding it the way I assume it was meant to be ridden, with big double loops and super high wind. A little bit like the Harlan Force in overall feel, just a bit heavier yet more powerful. If pushed, I would also have to say I do prefer this Ultra to the Force. This was the first 5-strut Alula kite I've tried since the first Ocean Rodeo a few years back, and it also makes me wonder if this is how the XR Pro feels in terms of bar pressure, being one of the other popular 5-strut Alula kites out there right now, in that it feels a bit light on the bar compared to some Dacron kites, just heavier than most Alula kites. But of course, it moves faster and performs at a higher level overall. I'd certainly wager the XR rides a lot heavier based on its shape, and is probably still, like other XRs, more challenging to progress on when it comes to loops, but I'd still wager the XR Pros jump higher. Like every Orbit, if you're not down for a yank, you can still pull the friendlier style high and tight loops, and the kite always wants to climb back up as fast as possible to catch you. But you do have to be a little more careful with this Ultra not to oversteer the kite because of how fast it is, which I don't think makes it ideal option in the range for people to progress into their first loops. Like I mentioned in the Orbit Pro review last year, I would still prefer an 8 or 9 meter standard orbit for riders looking to get into their first loops or their first basic loop variations, a bit like me, or at least up to my level perhaps. At my level, I certainly didn't have any issues with it in the loops, and even though it's been turned up a notch in terms of speed and power, I was still able to get all my loops, not feel like I was nervous about them, and it was stable and forgiving enough to get me out of trouble when I was making some errors with my timing. Since I have been riding this kite, I've thought a lot about what the goal was for it, and how it fits in with the overall Orbit lineup. I remember thinking when I rode the Orbit Pro for the first time that this does really feel like it's been made for the comp level rider, adapting to the trend of riding in bigger winds and mainly throwing double loops, with obviously technical variations as well. If you look at the North Big Air team, they certainly all seem to be pushing that side of Big Air, and in competitions usually tend to get all of their biggest scores with doubles, so it makes perfect sense that their top performance kite would focus the most on that style of riding. This certainly feels like the evolution of that Orbit Pro, but perhaps once again at the cost of its ease of use for us normies, and I would have a suspicion that a lot of the focus went on to how to make it the best in the sizes the pros are riding on in comps these days, which also does make me wonder if that translates as well to the larger sizes, at least value for money, and particularly for your average orbit enthusiast like myself. Alas, thus far, as with most kites, I've mainly tested the 9, with only a brief try on the 10 meter in probably suboptimal conditions for Big Air, where the wind was getting lighter in the early 20s on average with maybe some 25 knot gusts. And even though this may be the Alula version, and it is still very, very impressive for a 10 meter, it is still a 5-strut kite, and I believe prefers the stronger stuff wind-wise. From the short time I had on the 10, in terms of the low end, even though this version is better there than the other orbits, I would have preferred it if the Alula had given it a little bit more power in that area. This may be an unfair critique, because it's so hard to compare it to other kites other than my Evo D-Lab, because I've not tested that many 10s, and low end isn't normally something I am in the habit of testing for with these reviews, because my main focus is on Big Air. But I do believe, because of the added weight and slightly more loop-friendly, high-wind focused design on this Ultra, the Evo D-Lab would retain the edge in terms of the low end and overall power. But going back to where this Ultra shines, and the kite's intention if you ask me, it does make sense comparing it to previous iterations that the added power, lift, and speed at a cost of some bar pressure and potential confidence building for progressing riders would be exactly what their pro team are looking for, especially in the 6, 7, 8 meter size range where they are competing the most. But it's not necessarily ideal for my level rider, at least for the cost increase over the standard and pro orbits, which were already so ridiculously high performing for their relative cost. I recall at the time I tested last year the Orbit Pro, although I already had a full quiver of D-Labs, I did actually strongly consider buying that 9 meter because of how much fun it was when I was doing the review. The fact that even with Alula, they could only make this kite, marginally better for us non-pros is less a knock on this Ultra, which, don't get me wrong, is of course still brilliant, but more a testament to how ridiculous that Orbit Pro still is. If I was contemplating a new Orbit quiver, I would personally want to spend the Ultra money on the smaller size, I think, like a 7 or 8 meter, to get the most out of its added power and stability in super high winds, where I would be chasing the bigger scores on Woo or Surfer, where I think it would also ride the best, even with the tweaks, because of the heavier bar pressure wouldn't be as noticeable, and I'm not really going for trick progression there. Then I would stick to the Orbit Pro model, I think, in sizes 9 and up at my level, because they are already just brilliant value for the money, even if they don't quite have the same power and overall performance as the Ultra. Of course, money is different to everyone, so if it's not a factor in mind, you could certainly just go Alula all the way, as you don't really require the same level of skill as well in sizes 10 and up, because the added speed isn't obviously as relative in a higher size kite. I know this sounds like a bit of a contradiction to what I said in my Orbit Pro review, where I said I would prefer the standard Orbit because of its stability in the smaller sizes like the 7-8, but having been on 8-meter Alula kites now for over a year, I am more confident in using them in higher winds, and I do find this Ultra to be an amazing balance of added speed and power, but most importantly for big winds, stability. Looking at the 10 and up sizes, which admittedly I don't really review in general, I'd still be very happy riding a 10 or 11 meter Orbit Pro given the price they are, as they are arguably the best bang for buck in that size if you're still a big air focused rider who wants to loop on a larger size kite but doesn't want to pay Alula prices to do it. However, if you are going to get a little more low-end lift and hang time, of course, from the Ultra, board-offs and airstyle progression are going to be a bit easier for it, I believe, in the larger sizes. And you're possibly getting your money's worth there. Because everyone is going to ask, first and foremost, how does it compare to the Evo D-Lab? I think it has certainly narrowed the gap from the Orbit Pro to the Evo in terms of overall performance. And once again, the Ultra is a better kite for looping and loop-related progression, particularly with double loops. But outside of loops, I don't think it would quite have the overall performance if you factor in low-end boosting potential, hang time, and a bit more versatility in other disciplines. I do think this Ultra might be a little bit more forgiving though, because of just the loop-friendly nature that I focus on. If you've been following this channel, you would know that a year ago I spent over 10 grand buying my quiver of Evo D-Labs, including an 8, 10, 12 and a couple of bars. And despite a few warranty-related issues, they still are the benchmark for me for jumping potential, for riding in lighter winds on their respective sizes, and progressing at least with air style moves outside of loops. When it did come to big air tricks and loop variations, because of how aggressive I find the D-Labs for looping, I've actually made all my progression in the last year on the various 9-meter kites I've been demoing or borrowing for testing. And particularly the standard Orbit kites, or the Nitro or the Vortex. So I could see the Ultra fitting quite nicely into this little area where you get some added performance, but you can still make progress with loop tricks. But of course, there is also the possibility that it is just a bit too much kite for my level if I was to ride it in much, much stronger wind, or even trying to keep doing tricks on it. And thus, not the optimum progression kite for me personally. Even though it's just a brilliant fun for the skills I already have mastered, like big standard jumps and loops. Although I'm sure over time I would get more used to its power. All in all, I really had a blast on this Orbit Ultra, and it is definitely a step up in performance from its predecessors, which makes it a great addition to the Orbit lineup. But for many like me, although paying that extra coin may make you jump a little bit higher if you are already coming from Orbits, it is not going to guarantee that you're going to progress at a significantly faster rate, unless you already have the skills to handle it. And in some cases, it might actually slow you down in your progression. So after all that, thank you as always for making it this far. But before you go, let's just have a quick look at this new board I was riding, the Atmos Pro Carbon. So first off, you should probably go and watch my board review as a whole. It's a different video on my YouTube channel, as I am only going to be brief here, but my oh my did I love this board. It seems to have a similar shape and feel to the previous North Atmos Carbons, so obviously that's right in my wheelhouse, but they have managed to make it lighter and have added to give you a bit more control in the way of a heel side channel that is not so grippy that you notice it catching edges or slowing you down, but it seems to help you lock in place as you build up speed and load up for jumps. Even though I was riding it on bindings that were set too large for me, I still felt a noticeable level of improvement in overall performance from the previous model, which I'm more familiar with the same level of control. When I jumped back onto my 24 Atmos that was still in mint condition to confirm my thoughts, it felt noticeably heavier, slower, and rode with no better control than this new board. Although I was not able to ride them back to back, this board actually reminded me a lot like the Lue Falcon that I just recently rode, but with the control and familiarity of feel of my Atmos. I would have to say that if I was doing that board review again, perhaps this is recency bias, but I would likely add this as my easy number one. So you might be seeing me riding it in some future videos if I can talk my wife into letting me buy one when they come out. Thanks again as always. Check me out on Instagram if you want more up-to-date details on what I'm testing next, because there are a few more kites in the pipeline. As always, like, comment, definitely comment. That's how I get all this gear to test, really. And subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, goodbye.